By the end of World War II, the specter of an imminent working-class uprising that had so haunted the ruling classes of Europe and North America for the previous century had largely disappeared. This was because class war was suspended by a tacit settlement. To put it crudely, the white working class of the North Atlantic countries, from the United States to West Germany, were offered a deal. If they agreed to set aside any fantasies of fundamentally changing the nature of the system, then they would be allowed to keep their unions, enjoy a wide variety of social benefits, pensions, vacations, health care, and, perhaps most important, through generously funded and ever-expanding public educational institutions, know that their children had a reasonable chance of leaving the working class entirely. One key element in all this was a tacit guarantee that increases in workers' productivity would be met by increases in wages, a guarantee that held good until the late 1970s. Largely as a result, the period saw both rapidly rising productivity and rapidly rising incomes, laying the basis for the consumer economy of today. Economists call this the Keynesian Era, since it was a time in which John Maynard Keynes's economic theories, which already formed the basis of Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, were adopted by industrial democracies pretty much everywhere. With them came Keynes's rather casual attitude toward money. The reader will recall that Keynes fully accepted that banks do indeed create money out of thin air, and that for this reason there was no intrinsic reason that government policy should not encourage this during economic downturns as a way of stimulating demand, a position that had long been dear to the heart of debtors and anathema to creditors. Keynes himself had in his day been known to make some fairly radical noises, for instance calling for the complete elimination of that class of people who lived off other people's debts, the euthanasia of the rentier, as he put it, though all he really meant by this was their elimination through a gradual reduction of interest rates. As in so much of Keynesianism, this was much less radical than it first appeared. Actually, it was thoroughly in the great tradition of political economy, hearkening back to Adam Smith's ideal of a debtless utopia, but especially David Ricardo's condemnation of landlords as parasites, their very existence inimical to economic growth. Keynes was simply proceeding along the same lines, seeing rentiers as a feudal holdover inconsistent with the true spirit of capital accumulation. Far from a revolution, he saw it as the best way of avoiding one. I see, therefore, the rentier aspect of capitalism as a transitional phase which will disappear when it has done its work. And with the disappearance of its rentier aspect, much else in it besides will suffer a sea change. It will be, moreover, a great advantage of the order of events which I am advocating that the euthanasia of the rentier, of the functionless investor, will be nothing sudden and will need no revolution. When the Keynesian settlement was finally put into effect after World War II, it was offered only to a relatively small slice of the world's population. As time went on, more and more people wanted in on the deal. Almost all of the popular movements of the period from 1945 to 1975, even perhaps revolutionary movements, could be seen as demands for inclusion, demands for political equality that assumed equality was meaningless without some level of economic security. This was true not only of movements by minority groups in North Atlantic countries who had first been left out of the deal, such as those for whom Dr. King spoke, but what were then called national liberation movements, from Algeria to Chile, or finally, and perhaps most dramatically, in the late 1960s and 1970s, feminism. At some point in the 70s, things reached a breaking point. It would appear that capitalism as a system simply cannot extend such a deal to everyone. Quite possibly it wouldn't even remain viable if all its workers were free wage laborers. Certainly it will never be able to provide everyone in the world the sort of life lived by, say, a 1960s auto worker in Michigan or Turin with his own house, garage, and children in college. And this was true even before so many of those children began demanding less stultifying lives. The result might be termed a crisis of inclusion. By the late 1970s, the existing order was clearly in a state of collapse, plagued simultaneously by financial chaos, food riots, oil shock, widespread doomsday prophecies of the end of growth, and ecological crisis, all of which, it turned out, proved to be ways of putting the populace on notice that all deals were off. The moment that we start framing the story this way, it's easy to see that the next 30 years, the period from roughly 1978 to 2009, follows nearly the same pattern, except that the deal, the settlement, had changed. Certainly, when both Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK launched a systematic attack on the power of labor unions, as well as on the legacy of Keynes, it was a way of explicitly declaring that all previous deals were off. Everyone could now have political rights, even by the 1990s most everyone in Latin America and Africa. But political rights were to become economically meaningless. The link between productivity and wages was chopped to bits. Productivity rates have continued to rise, but wages have stagnated or even atrophied. This was accompanied at first by a return to monetarism, the doctrine that even though money was no longer in any way based in gold or in any other commodity, government and central bank policy should be primarily concerned with carefully controlling the money supply to ensure that it acted as if it were a scarce commodity, even as, at the same time, the financialization of capital meant that most money being invested in the marketplace was completely detached from any relation to production of commerce at all, but had become pure speculation. All this is not to say that the people of the world were not being offered something, just that, as I say, the terms had changed. In the new dispensation, wages would no longer rise, but workers were encouraged to buy a piece of capitalism. Rather than euthanize the rentier, everyone could now become rentiers, effectively could grab a chunk of the profits created by their own increasingly dramatic rates of exploitation. The means were many and familiar. In the United States, there were 401k retirement accounts and an endless variety of other ways of encouraging ordinary citizens to play the market, but at the same time encouraging them to borrow. One of the guiding principles of Thatcherism and Reaganism alike was that economic reforms would never gain widespread support unless ordinary working people could at least aspire to owning their own homes. To this was added by the 1990s and 2000s endless mortgage refinancing schemes that treated houses, whose value it was assumed would only rise, like ATMs, as the popular catchphrase had it, though it turns out in retrospect it was really more like credit cards. Then there was the proliferation of actual credit cards juggled against one another. Here, for many, buying a piece of capitalism slithered undetectably into something indistinguishable from those familiar scourges of the working poor, the loan shark and the pawnbroker. It did not help here that in 1980, U.S. federal usury laws, which had previously limited interest to between 7 and 10%, were eliminated by act of Congress. Just as the United States had managed to largely get rid of the problem of political corruption by making the bribery of legislators effectively legal, it was redefined as lobbying, so the problem of loan sharking was brushed aside by making real interest rates of 25%, 50%, or even in some cases, for instance for payday loans, 120% annually, once typical only of organized crime, perfectly legal, and therefore enforceable no longer by just hired goons and the sort of people who placed mutilated animals on their victims' doorsteps, but by judges, lawyers, bailiffs, and police. Any number of names have been coined to describe the new dispensation, from the democratization of finance to the financialization of everyday life. Outside the United States, it came to be known as neoliberalism. As an ideology, it meant that not just the market, but capitalism, I must continually remind the reader that these are not the same thing, became the organizing principle of almost everything. We were all to think of ourselves as tiny corporations, organized around that same relationship of investor and executive, between the cold, calculating math of the banker and the warrior who, indebted, has abandoned any sense of personal honor and turned himself into a kind of disgraced machine. In this world, paying one's debts can well come to seem the very definition of morality, if only because so many people fail to do it. For instance, it has become a regular feature of many sorts of business in America that large corporations or even some small businesses, faced with a debt, will almost automatically simply see what happens if they do not pay, complying only if reminded, goaded, or presented with some sort of legal writ. In other words, the principle of honor has thus been almost completely removed from the marketplace. As a result, perhaps, the whole subject of debt becomes surrounded by a halo of religion. Actually, one might even speak of a double theology, one for the creditors, another for the debtors. It is no coincidence that the new phase of American debt imperialism has also been accompanied by the rise of the evangelical right, who, in defiance of almost all previously existing Christian theology, have enthusiastically embraced the doctrine of supply-side economics, that creating money and effectively giving it to the rich is the most biblically appropriate way to bring about national prosperity. Perhaps the most ambitious theologian of the new creed was George Gilder, whose book Wealth and Poverty became a bestseller in 1981 at the very dawn of what came to be known as the Reagan Revolution. Gilder's argument was that those who felt that money could not simply be created were mired in an old-fashioned, godless materialism that did not realize that just as God could create something out of nothing, his greatest gift to humanity was creativity itself, which proceeded in exactly the same way. Investors can indeed create value out of nothing by their willingness to accept the risk entailed in placing their faith in others' creativity. Rather than seeing the imitation of God's powers of creation ex nihilo as hubris, Gilder argued that it was precisely what God intended. The creation of money was a gift, a blessing, a channeling of grace. A promise, yes, but not one that can be fulfilled, even if the bonds are continually rolled over, because through faith, in God we trust again, their value becomes reality. Economists who themselves do not believe in the future of capitalism will tend to ignore the dynamics of chance and faith that largely will determine that future. Economists who distrust religion will always fail to comprehend the modes of worship by which progress is achieved. Chance is the foundation of change and the vessel of the divine. Such effusions inspired evangelists like Pat Robertson to declare supply-side economics the first truly divine theory of money creation. Meanwhile, for those who could not simply create money, there was a quite different theological dispensation. Debt is the new fat, Margaret Atwood recently remarked, struck by how much the advertisements that surround her daily on the bus in her native Toronto had abandoned their earlier attempts to make riders panic about the creeping terrors of sexual unattractiveness, but instead turned to providing advice on how to free oneself from the much more immediate terrors of the repo man. There are even debt TV shows which have a familiar religious revival ring to them. There are accounts of shopaholic binges during which you don't know what came over you and everything was a blur, with tearful confessions by those who've spent themselves into quivering insomniac jellies of hopeless indebtedness, and have resorted to lying, cheating, stealing, and kiting checks between bank accounts as a result. There are testimonials by families and loved ones whose lives have been destroyed by the debtor's harmful behavior. There are compassionate but severe admonitions by the television host, who here plays the part of priest or revivalist. There's a moment of seeing the light, followed by repentance and a promise never to do it again. There's a penance imposed, snip, snip go the scissors on the credit cards, followed by a strict curb on spending regimen. And finally, if all goes well, the debts are paid down, the sins are forgiven, absolution is granted, and a new day dawns in which a sadder but more solvent man you rise the morrow morn. Here, risk-taking is in no sense the vessel of the divine. Quite the opposite. But for the poor it's always different. In a way, what Atwood describes might be seen as the perfect inversion of the prophetic voice of Reverend King's I Have a Dream speech. Whereas the first post-war age was about collective claims on the nation's debt to its humblest citizens, the need for those who have made false promises to redeem themselves, now those same humble citizens are taught to think of themselves as sinners, seeking some kind of purely individual redemption to have the right to any sort of moral relations with other human beings at all. At the same time, there is something profoundly deceptive going on here. All these moral dramas start from the assumption that personal debt is ultimately a matter of self-indulgence, a sin against one's loved ones, and therefore that redemption must necessarily be a matter of purging and restoration of ascetic self-denial. What's being shunted out of sight here is, first of all, the fact that everyone is now in debt. U.S. household debt is now estimated at, on average, 130% of income, and that very little of this debt was accrued by those determined to find money to bet on the horses or toss away on fripperies. Insofar as it was borrowed for what economists like to call discretionary spending, it was mainly to be given to children, to share with friends, or otherwise to be able to build and maintain relations with other human beings that are based on something other than sheer material calculation. One must go into debt to achieve a life that goes in any way beyond sheer survival. Insofar as there is a politics here, it seems a variation on a theme seen since the dawn of capitalism. Ultimately, it's sociality itself that's treated as abusive, criminal, demonic. To this, most ordinary Americans, including black and Latino Americans, recent immigrants, and others who were formerly excluded from credit, have responded with a stubborn insistence on continuing to love one another. They continue to acquire houses for their families, liquor and sound systems for parties, gifts for friends. They even insist on continuing to hold weddings and funerals, regardless of whether this is likely to send them skirting default or bankruptcy, apparently figuring that, as long as everyone now has to remake themselves as miniature capitalists, why shouldn't they be allowed to create money out of nothing too? Granted, the role of discretionary spending itself should not be exaggerated. The chief cause of bankruptcy in America is catastrophic illness. Most borrowing is simply a matter of survival. If one does not have a car, one cannot work. And increasingly, simply being able to go to college now almost necessarily means debt peonage for at least half one's subsequent working life. Still, it is useful to point out that for real human beings, survival is rarely enough. Nor should it be. By the 1990s, the same tensions had begun to reappear on a global scale as the older penchant for loaning money for grandiose state-directed projects like the Aswan Dam gave way to an emphasis on microcredit. Inspired by the success of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, the new model was to identify budding entrepreneurs in poor communities and provide them with small, low-interest loans. Credit, the Grameen Bank insisted, is a human right. At the same time, the idea was to draw on the social capital, the knowledge, networks, connections, and ingenuity that the poor people of the world are already using to get by in difficult circumstances, and convert it into a way of generating even more expansive capital, able to grow at 5 to 20% annually. As anthropologists like Julia Elyashar discovered, the result is double-edged. As one unusually candid NGO consultant explained to her in Cairo in 1995, money is empowerment. This is empowerment money. You need to be big, need to think big. Borrowers here can be imprisoned if they don't pay, so why be worried? In America, we get 10 offers for credit cards in the mail every day. You pay incredible real interest rates for that credit, something like 40%. But the offer is there, so you get the card and stuff your wallet full of credit cards. You feel good. It should be the same thing here. Why not help them get into debt? Do I really care what they use the money for, as long as they pay the loan back? The very incoherence of the quote is telling. The only unifying theme seems to be people ought to be in debt. It's good in itself. It's empowering. Anyway, if they end up too empowered, we can also have them arrested. Debt and power, sin and redemption become almost indistinguishable. Freedom is slavery. Slavery is freedom. During her time in Cairo, Elyashar witnessed young graduates of an NGO training program go on strike for their right to receive startup loans. At the same time, just about everyone involved took it for granted that most of their fellow students, not to mention everyone else involved in the program, was corrupt and exploiting the system as their personal cash cow. Here, too, aspects of economic life that had been based on long-standing relations of trust were, through the intrusion of credit bureaucracies, becoming effectively criminalized. Within another decade, the entire project, even in South Asia where it began to appear suspiciously similar to the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis. All sorts of unscrupulous lenders piled in, all sorts of deceptive financial appraisals were passed off to investors, interest accumulated, borrowers tried to collectively refuse payment, lenders began sending in goons to seize what little wealth they had, corrugated tin roofs, for example, and the end result has been an epidemic of suicides by poor farmers caught in traps from which their families could never possibly escape. Just as in the 1945 to 1975 cycle, this new one culminated in another crisis of inclusion. It proved no more possible to really turn everyone in the world into micro-corporations or to democratize credit in such a way that every family that wanted to could have a house. And if you think about it, if we have the means to build them, why shouldn't they? Are there families who don't deserve houses? Than it had been to allow all wage laborers to have unions, pensions, and health benefits. Capitalism doesn't work that way. It is ultimately a system of power and exclusion, and when it reaches the breaking point, the symptoms recur, just as they had in the 1970s. Food riots, oil shock, financial crisis, the sudden, startled realization that the current course was ecologically unsustainable, attendant apocalyptic scenarios of every sort. In the wake of the subprime collapse, the U.S. government was forced to decide who really gets to make money out of nothing, the financiers or ordinary citizens. The results were predictable. Financiers were bailed out with taxpayer money, which basically means that their imaginary money was treated as if it were real. Mortgage holders were overwhelmingly left to the tender mercies of the courts under a bankruptcy law that Congress had a year before, rather suspiciously, presciently, one might add, made far more exacting against debtors. Nothing was altered. All major decisions were postponed. The great conversation that many were expecting never happened. We live now at a genuinely peculiar historical juncture. The credit crisis has provided us with a vivid illustration of the principle set out in the last chapter, that capitalism cannot really operate in a world where people believe it will be around forever. For most of the last several centuries, most people assumed that credit could not be generated infinitely because they assumed that the economic system itself was unlikely to endure forever. The future was likely to be fundamentally different. Yet somehow, the anticipated revolutions never happened. The basic structures of financial capitalism largely remained in place. It's only now, at the very moment when it's becoming increasingly clear that current arrangements are not viable, that we suddenly have hit the wall in terms of our collective imagination. There is very good reason to believe that in a generation or so, capitalism itself will no longer exist. Most obviously, as ecologists keep reminding us, because it's impossible to maintain an engine of perpetual growth forever on a finite planet, and the current form of capitalism doesn't seem to be capable of generating the kind of vast technological breakthroughs and mobilizations that would be required for us to start finding and colonizing any other planets. Yet faced with the prospect of capitalism actually ending, the most common reaction, even from those who call themselves progressives, is simply fear. We cling to what exists because we can no longer imagine an alternative that wouldn't be even worse. How did we get here? My own suspicion is that we are looking at the final effects of the militarization of American capitalism itself. In fact, it could well be said that the last 30 years have seen the construction of a vast bureaucratic apparatus for the creation and maintenance of hopelessness, a giant machine designed first and foremost to destroy any sense of possible alternative futures. At its root is a veritable obsession on the part of the rulers of the world, in response to the upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s, with ensuring that social movements cannot be seen to grow, flourish, or propose alternatives, that those who challenge existing power arrangements can never, under any circumstances, be perceived to win. To do so requires creating a vast apparatus of armies, prisons, police, various forms of private security firms, and police and military intelligence apparatus, and propaganda engines of every conceivable variety, most of which do not attack alternatives directly so much as create a pervasive climate of fear, jingoistic conformity, and simple despair that renders any thought of changing the world seem an idle fantasy. Maintaining this apparatus seems even more important to exponents of the free market even than maintaining any sort of viable market economy. How else can one explain what happened in the former Soviet Union? One would ordinarily have imagined that the end of the Cold War would have led to the dismantling of the army and the KGB and rebuilding the factories, but in fact what happened was precisely the other way around. This is just an extreme example of what has been happening everywhere. Economically, the apparatus is pure dead weight. All the guns, surveillance cameras, and propaganda engines are extraordinarily expensive and really produce nothing, and no doubt it's yet another element dragging the entire capitalist system down, along with producing the illusion of an endless capitalist future that laid the groundwork for the endless bubbles to begin with. Finance capital became the buying and selling of chunks of that future, and economic freedom for most of us was reduced to the right to buy a small piece of one's own permanent subordination. In other words, there seems to have been a profound contradiction between the political imperative of establishing capitalism as the only possible way to manage anything, and capitalism's own unacknowledged need to limit its future horizons, lest speculation, predictably, go haywire. Once it did, and the whole machine imploded, we were left in the strange situation of not being able to even imagine any other way that things might be arranged. About the only thing we can imagine is catastrophe. To begin to free ourselves, the first thing we need to do is to see ourselves again as historical actors, as people who can make a difference in the course of world events. This is exactly what the militarization of history is trying to take away. Even if we are at the beginning of the turn of a very long historical cycle, it's still largely up to us to determine how it's going to turn out. For instance, the last time we shifted from a bullion economy to one of virtual credit money at the end of the Axial Age and the beginning of the Middle Ages, the immediate shift was experienced largely as a series of great catastrophes. Will it be the same this time around? Presumably, a lot depends on how consciously we set out to ensure that it won't be. Will a return to virtual money lead to a move away from empires and vast standing armies, and to the creation of larger structures limiting the depredations of creditors? There is good reason to believe that all these things will happen, and if humanity is to survive, they will probably have to. But we have no idea how long it will take, or what, if it does, it would really look like. Capitalism has transformed the world in many ways that are clearly irreversible. What I have been trying to do in this book is not so much to propose a vision of what precisely the next age will be like, but to throw open perspectives, enlarge our sense of possibilities, to begin to ask what it would mean to start thinking on a breadth and with a grandeur appropriate to the time.